life castings through mold making into sculptures with alien clay and Rebound mold making rubbers. And myself, Milo, your friendly neighborhood mold maker. Now in today's video, we're going to show you a step-by-step process that we took to create an original sculpture using alien clay from an original life casting we took of Buddy Rhodes, so that we can make a mold using Rebound and create many different castings in different mediums, including one in concrete that Buddy himself is going to be doing. Now, this is a multi-part video, so if you want to check out the making of the life casting, there is a link in the description below. You can check that out. Otherwise, stick around. We're going to jump into this project and see how we've done. To start the casting process, we first need to heat up some of the alien clay. We actually need to melt it down to a liquefied state so it can be poured into our mold. To begin, I'm first going to program the crock pot here and start the melting process. And in the meantime, I can go ahead and start cutting some of the alien clay blocks that we have. This is a bar of alien clay. When you purchase an entire box of the material, it comes in these bars. And to soften up, I'm going to chunk it up and put it in the crock pot. Now, a periodic mixing of the material will ensure that the material doesn't separate in any way and stays consistent. So a periodic mixing is important. Another important thing is the preheating of the mold. We're pouring a molten liquid clay that's high in temperature into a cold mold. Is not going to result in good results, so make sure you preheat that mold. And then carefully, wearing protective gear, we're going to scoop out some of the alien clay and pour it into the mold. Always be careful when handling hot molten materials. And then we're going to start the rotational casting process to make sure that we cover all the surfaces inside the mold and capture the detail of the mold. Now the mold is spun around until the material starts to solidify. We want to make sure that the material is not moving before we add more material into the mold. So spin the mold around, make sure that the material solidifies in even thickness. That's why we keep spinning the mold. When doing rotational casting like this, you want to make sure that you spin the mold 360 degrees so that the material inside the mold covers all the surfaces and therefore captures all the detail from the original. The alien clay is allowed 10 minutes in between layers to cool and harden inside the mold. Also keep in mind that you can turn down the crockpot temperature or turn it off completely in order to cool down the additional layers of the clay and so build up the thickness that we require much faster. And then we can add another layer of the alien clay. We want to build up a thickness that's about 3/8 to 1/2 inch thick of the alien clay. So additional layers are poured and then rotationally casted until we get a desired thickness. You want to keep in mind that we will be resculpting this casting, so in case we cut into the casting, we don't want to go past the clay layer. We want to have enough thickness off the clay so that it doesn't go through. Here you can see me pointing to the ear. That means I'm trying to fill the ear cavity with a solid layer of the alien clay. That will prevent any possibility of the ear breaking in the demolding process. Now we're going to backfill our cavity with some expanding foam, and for that I'm using the Foam It 4 Black. I like the black because of the color, but be aware the working time of the material is 1.5 minutes, so work fast but work thoroughly. So here I'm using a mechanical mixer because you are getting a better rise out of the material when using a mechanical mixer. And then scrape the side, scrape the bottom before pouring the material into the mold. And because I need every bit of that material, I'm going to scrape everything out of the mixing cup into our mold and then start a rotational casting process. And why we're doing the rotational casting process? So that we can cover all the inside perimeter walls with a layer of foam so it expands evenly from all sides. And then we're going to introduce an armature into that foam and let the foam expand around the armature. Now, the reason why we're backfilling this casting with foam instead of casting it solid is the fact that when casting things solid in hot material, they do tend to shrink and cause voids and unnecessary issues in the casting. Also, the casting will become very, very heavy, deeming it very hard and difficult to work with. Furthermore, the armature provides us a base that we can easily mount to a working surface and then easily continue and finish our sculpt. The foam at 4 black is now allowed 2 hours cure before moving on to the next step. So after 2 hours, the material has set up where it's hard and we can go ahead and demold our original. But before that, we're going to mount the armature on a working surface so we don't damage the clay sculpt itself, the clay casting. And then slowly we're going to peel that mold away to reveal an alien clay casting that we can now rework. The cleanup process now begins by removing any boogers, as they're called, from the clay casting. So any bubbles that might ended up as solid castings are now removed. And we're going to open the eyes of the casting. So we're going to sculpt eyes into the casting itself. So those eyelids need to be opened up and the eyeball needs to be sculpted in. So that's what I'm doing here. It's quite a slow process, takes a lot of detailed work to make it look realistic. So take your time when working on projects like this, but one thing I do like is that the alien clay is keeping the shape that I sculpted into very easily, so I don't have to worry about the sculpting distorting in any way by simply bumping it. Once you sculpt it in there, it stays there until you change it. Here we're adding some of the eyebrows. And finally, we're adding the hair. So here I'm just adding big globs of material, which is nice to have a crock pot on the side that's always keeping the material warm and ready to be used. Once the alien clay is applied to the sculpt, it actually cools down quite rapidly and is easy to work with within a short period of time. Now, this sculpt is going to need a base, so a bust without a base is not really a bust. So here we're going to make a base using sheets of the alien clay that I poured in about 1/4 inch thick sheets in a mold. Let it solidify, and now I'm building up a base using those sheets. And then with a heated tool, I run in the joints between the two areas that I'm trying to bond. The heated tool melts the alien clay and allows it to bond firmly together. A little bit of pressure by fingers makes that fusion much, much better. And then we're going to come back and start resculpting some of the hair that's now fully set up and cooled down. As many artists there are also many sculpting tools. So use whatever sculpting tools fits your particular work style to achieve the goals necessary. And here I'm adding Buddy's name to the front so we can clearly identify who this was. And here's the final sculpt that we have in the alien clay. I'm happy with the sculpt now, and I'm ready to proceed on to the molding process. For the molding process, we're using the Rebound 25. This is a platinum brush-on silicone. But do keep in mind the material's working time. So the Rebound 25 has a working time of 20 minutes and a cure of 6 hours. One thing to consider here, we're applying in very gentle brush strokes. We're not trying to add any texture to the original model. So go slowly and go deliberately by carefully brushing the material onto the model. Remember, it's made out of clay, so we don't want to disturb the surface finish. Once you apply the material to the model, we're going to use some compressed air to blow the Rebound 25 into all the crevices, all the detail of the original. So this is a technique that you would use when you're not able to stipple the material onto the model. And you really want to focus, make sure you get the material into small crevices like the eyes, nose, the writing in the front. Those are going to be difficult areas, as well as the ear. The material is now allowed 60 minutes partial cure before moving on to the next step. The second layer is applied the same way that we applied the first layer, with the only difference that we pigmented the second layer so we can clearly see where we're applying this layer's material. Layer 2.5, we thickened up with some Thyvex to fill any of the deep recesses and undercuts in the eyes, ears, chin, nose, mouth, and so on. In between the layers, the material is allowed partial cures for 60 minutes. Planning ahead, we're embedding a piece of reinforcement cloth in the top of the head of our mold. This is the area where we're going to cut the mold up until, so this will be the stopping area of our cut. This will prevent any tearing in the mold from the constant opening and closing from the demolding process. The rest of that batch is poured in aluminum channels. These are going to be our separation channels for the different parts of the support shell, as well as keys for the support shell. So we'll pour these in aluminum channels and let them set up for about 3 hours before demolding them and using them on the mold. You don't have to let them set up fully. These are now moved aside and allowed a partial cure of 3 hours. In the meantime, we can proceed with the next layer. We're going to mix another layer of material and apply it over most of the areas that show only blue in this case. We're trying to keep the material application even, so applying a layer over all the surfaces every time we apply it is very helpful. Now, the layer 3.5 is the thickened layer. This layer lets you control the thickness of your final mold. So here you can see that I'm adding the material in a much thicker fashion. I'm not using a brush, I'm using a mixing stick, and I'm filling all the areas to a uniform, smooth surface. The entire mold is covered with a thickened layer, and keep in mind you want to aim for a thickness of about half to 5/8, 3/4 of an inch, depending on the size of the mold. This one here, we're aiming for about 1/2 inch thickness all throughout. And once these layer 3.5 is applied, we're going to allow it a partial cure for 1 hour. Now that the material has partially set up, where we're able to peel out those separation channels, and here I'm cutting them in very strategic areas. We're going to shape this to the actual mold. So I cut them specifically to bend the material around the corner. Keep in mind that those cuts do need to be also filled with the thickened silicone. That way they won't cause any delamination issues when we go to demold our castings out of the mold. So here you can see I apply a layer of the thickened Rebound 25 to an area where the separation strip goes down, and then we apply a layer of the same material to the strip itself. The strip is then applied to the mold and held in place by sewing pins. The material that squeezes out on the side is thinned out and feathered out around the key itself, making it nice and smooth. Finally, around the bottom, around the perimeter of our mold, we have also a channel that goes around, and this is going to create a nice locking mechanism with the edge of our support shell. Again, sewing pins are utilized to hold everything in place while it sets up. We're going to allow it a partial cure for 1 hour. All right, now that the material has partially set up, we can remove the pins. The sewing pins, so we're going to put those aside because we will reuse them for another project. And then here I want to show you an additional locking mechanism step that I did. So
You can see here I cut some of that channel, the separation channel, with a bevel in it. That bevel is going to create a locking mechanism in our support shell. Now these keys are applied to the cut seam line. So this is the cut seam line in the back of the mold that we're going to finally cut open once we demold the original. These keys are going to help us lock in the mold in the support shell perfectly to minimize any kind of seam lines we're going to get in our castings. So think ahead of time, think what makes most sense, and then try to implement those thoughts in your final application. The material is now allowed a partial cure 60 minutes before moving on to the next step. Now, once we remove the sewing pins, we can finalize our mold by applying one final layer of the Rebound 25 over all surfaces. This final layer allows us to lock in all the previous layers and make sure that none of these layers will delaminate from each other. So especially the last layer with the keys, we want to make sure that that stays adhered to the previous layer. So this final encapsulating layer should cover all surfaces. And now we're going to allow this mold 6 hours to cure before moving on to the next step. The next step in our mold making process is to trim back some of that buildup of the silicone. So we're going to trim the perimeter of our mold to create a nice clean edge. And then we're going to proceed by cutting a very precise cut in the separation line of our mold. So this is the separation line where the two halves of the support shell are going to meet. So I'm only cutting this about 5 millimeters in, 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of an inch, better say, deep. So that way it doesn't cut all the way through. This cut is simply there to allow us to insert these aluminum shims that are going to create a barrier between the two halves of our support shell. And you see here, I start with keyed shims first. I insert the keyed shims, and then I fill the spaces in between. The keyed shims are going to allow our support shell to align perfectly with the other half. Once the aluminum shims are inserted, I trace the entire shim buildup with scissors, make sure the line is nice and clean, because I will be running my mixing stick, mixing tools, application tool across that edge. Now we can apply some Sonite wax to the working surface. So the working board gets some Sonite wax, as well as the aluminum shims. So anywhere where we're going to be applying the support shell material, we want to make sure we apply a layer of the Sonite wax. That's going to prevent anything from sticking to the Plasti-Paste or vice versa. Now for the support shell, like I mentioned, we're using the Plasti-Paste II. When mixing the Plasti-Paste, make sure that you scrape the sides and scrape the bottom off the mixing container. And once you mix the material thoroughly, make sure that you get it out of the mixing container, especially if you're working with larger mass like this right here. The material has an exothermic reaction, and once the heat starts to kick in the material to cure the product, you don't want to have it in a large mass. You want to spread it out thin and therefore prolong its working time, or at least stay true to the original working time. If the material is concentrated in mass and the exotherm starts to kick in, it will cure the material in a flash, wasting a lot of material and rendering it useless. Once the first layer is fully applied, we can start by mixing a second batch. There's no need to wait a partial cure. By the time you mix up the next batch, the previous batch has already partially cured and is ready to go. So once we get a consistent thickness on the entire build of about 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch, between 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch, depending on the size, then we achieve the final thickness. Now here I am applying some buttresses to the support shell, and they actually have several different functions here. First of all, they stiffen the overall build of the support shell. Second of all, they create legs for the mold to stand on when it's finished. And thirdly, they create handles for the mold to be handled in the molding process. This is why it's important to think ahead when creating molds and support shells. It's important to keep the end result and the casting process in mind and therefore design the mold around this process. The Plasti-Paste II is now allowed a cure of 90 minutes before proceeding on to the next step. And once the first half of our support shell has cured, we can start by removing the aluminum shims, and then we're going to apply a layer of the sonite wax again to that separation line. So the first half of the support shell and the working surface get a layer of the sonite wax, making sure that the second half of our support shell does not bond to the first half or the working surface. Now we're going to repeat the same process as far as mixing and applying the Plasti-Paste II to the second half of our support shell, with one slight difference. You see in the layer 2 and 3 that I'm clearly staying off of the tops of those keys, and that is very strategic. Make sure that you don't cover those keys completely. By not covering the back of the key, we're actually able to pop the key in and out of the support shell much easier from within the mold when we're setting up the mold. And we're also able to manipulate and move that key around in case it's not finding its original seating. Now, once you build up the thickness of the support shell that you require, we're going to then allow the material to cure for 90 minutes before moving on to the next step. Now, after the material has cured, we're ready to demold our original, and we're going to start by prying the two halves of the support shell open slowly. You can see I'm going around the perimeter, prying it slowly, not putting too much pressure at any given point. And there you have it. The first half of the support shell comes off very easily, and we're able to slide the second half off as well. So there you have the two halves of the support shell finished, and we're now ready to demold the original. To cut the mold open and retrieve the original model out of the mold, I simply cut a zigzag line down the back seam line of our mold. Remember to go slowly and always cut in a S-curve or a zigzag line down. That will allow the two halves of the mold to easily find back to each other. The mold is now slowly peeled away from the model, and with a little bit of finesse and luck, we're actually able to save the model without distorting or breaking any of its features. The mold can now be reassembled for the casting process. Before completely closing the mold, we want to apply a layer of the sonite wax to the area where the mold is split, where we place that cut in the mold. This is the area where the mold most likely will leak, if it does, and we don't want to have any of the support shell and the casting material bond to each other. Therefore, a little bit of sonite wax will go a long way. Also, it does facilitate the easy removal of those keys out of the support shell, so they will easily slide over the silicone or vice versa. For the casting of our project here, we decided to use the Matrix Dryve, which is a polymer modified gypsum. This has a mix ratio of 3 parts powder to 1 part water by volume. Note that by mixing the components together, we always want to add the powder component into the liquid. The working time of the material is 20 minutes when mixed using a drill mixer and has a cure of 90 minutes. A final scrape on the sides and the bottom with a mixing stick makes sure there's no unmixed components left in the container. To start the casting process, I'm simply going to pour some of the Matrix Dryve into the mold, and then I'm going to rotationally cast it. I'm going to spin the mold in a 360-degree fashion to make sure that all the surfaces inside that mold are covered with a layer of the material. This will prevent any kind of air bubbles forming on the surface of our casting if we would pour all the material at once. So now that we have a layer of material on all the surfaces, we can top off the mold. And once again, I'm not filling the mold all the way. I'm filling it right up to the neck And then we're going to tilt the mold back and forth. This is called burping the mold, or forcing any of the last large air bubbles to make their way out. And once we tilt the mold back and forth a couple of times, we can go ahead and top off the mold with rest of the material. So I'm simply going to pour the rest of the product into the mold. I can now simply top off the mold with the rest of the material and allow it to cure for 90 minutes before moving on to the next step. All right, it's now been 90 minutes and we're into the demolding process of our casting. And as you can see here, the mold has captured all the detail from the original clay casting that we got out of a original life casting of Buddy. And here is Buddy inspecting the final touches on the castings, as well as having a good time visiting us here at Smooth On headquarters. Now, if you got inspired by this project and you'd like to give your own projects a go and need some material, you can visit any one of our distributors around the world.
So, and there you have it, a step-by-step procedure that I took to create this original sculpture of life casting that we took of Buddy himself, so that we can create a durable mold that we can cast many different mediums into without having many restrictions. Now, remember, this is a one-part to a multi-part video. There are links in the description below if you want to check out the making of the life casting, or if you want to see Buddy himself cast into this Rebound 25 mold, make sure you check out that link in the description below. Now, if you have an idea about what we should do next, please let us know down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button to keep up with our latest mold making, casting, and other videos. Remember to subscribe.